I think it's helpful because, like, thinking about these things, like, for example, like, you talked a lot about, like, the kalam, like, I think about, like, your debate with, like, Andrew Loker, or how you think about these things, when you're looking at, like, your theory, how does that, like, change how you approach the argument? Because I remember, like, in that debate you had with Loki, a lot of the problem was, like, you were fine with saying the universe began to exist from some sort of initial state, and there's just no cause, and that seemed, like, to be the stalemate, and it seemed like it was just because of, like, potentially, like, your kind of, like, theory with regards to, like, naturalism and not needing to go, like, beyond that. So if I'm making sense, could you kind of talk about that? Because I think that's super helpful at this point.
Okay, so I mean, one way to think about um, this part of the discussion about the Kalam is to think about what might be without explanation in
Hmm.
competing naturalist and theistic theories. And for this, what's relevant is what they're saying about whether there's an initial state of causal reality, and if there is one, kind of what's its modal status. So you might, by which I mean whether it's contingent or necessary. So you might think that there's a regress in causal reality, or you might think that there's an initial state that's just entirely contingent. The things that exist in it are contingent, and all the properties that the things have are contingent. Or you might think that there's the state's contingent, but there's some things that exist in it, at least one that exists of necessity. Or you might think that the state's necessary, so there are things that exist in it of necessity, and the kind of properties that things that exist in the state have are necessary as well. Now, it seemed to me, so I argued this first quite a long time ago, that when you're comparing theism and naturalism, you have exactly the same options here, whether you're a theist or a naturalist. You can make a version that fits any of those. The one that I like the most, but I'm not I'm not going to die in a ditch for it, is one that says that the initial state's necessary, um, so that what exists in it exists necessarily in the first state and has its properties of necessity in the first state. Now, since I don't know what the initial state of natural reality is, no scientists know yet because we have no science that tells us, that leaves certain questions unanswered, but it answers enough questions to make it clear that no cosmological argument is going to decide between naturalism and theism if the general things that I've just been saying are right.
Hmm. So when I'm thinking about your view, like just like going to this idea of the initial state, like it seems like to me like one of the reasons, like correct me where I'm wrong here, is like when you prefer like naturalism is so in the like the naturalist framework with we're looking at like say like the Kalam, we have this initial state, and the theist is kind of like maybe like that's your necessary item, and the theist is going to add God, who creates the initial state. And we say like the theist would say God is necessary, the initial state's contingent, and you would just say like the initial state's necessary. So like in that like thinking about this way, like naturalism may have this advantage because it just posits less because we both have something necessary, but the naturalist doesn't have to posit God in addition to the initial state. Is that kind of, in a sense, like sketching it
Yeah.
out?
So that's how I'm going to argue it in every case. Like if there's an infinite regress,
Hmm.
having God is extra. If the initial state's contingent, having God's extra. If the initial state's necessary, having God's extra. So there's no advantage here. I mean, sometimes I've said, no, if there's any advantage here, it's actually to the naturalist because they're committed to less. But that's not a very significant consideration because this is kind of one data point and there's 1,000 things that are relevant to the decision between naturalism and theism. But if I'm right, if the argument that we're discussing works, then obviously insofar as there are cosmological arguments, the better ones are cosmological arguments for naturalism, not
Hmm.
cosmological arguments for theism.